translation study, museums, translation, and semiotics, as well as national and cultural image building through translation at the University of Tartu. She is the guest editor of the 2024 special issue Museums as Spaces of Cultural Translation and Transfer at Babel. The title of her presentation is Between the Self and the Other, Exploring Illusions of Museological Chronotope. So you can take it away, Irmak.
Okay, thank you very much for introducing me. And I would like to thank Ludmila, Tyler, and Israel for organizing this event. And also, of course, to Jorge for sharing the session with me. If everyone is ready, I will start sharing my screen. Please confirm that you can see it.
Looks good, yeah. Yeah, now you're in full screen, yeah, good.
Okay, perfect. Then let's start. Well, welcome everyone. As you can see from the title of my presentation, my talk is going to be centered around museums. And more specifically, I will be talking about also translation and otherness in connection to museums. Now, when we perhaps first look at these three words on the screen, we may think that they are not quite related to each other. Maybe they are not the concepts that we immediately associate with each other, but hopefully through this talk, I will try to illustrate that not only they can be closely tied together, closely connected together, but in certain cases, they can even be interchangeably used with each other. And in order to show that, I will first start with basically defining translation in relation to the concept of otherness or alterity. And then I will also discuss what a museum is, really. What do we know about museums apart from our maybe visits to these big buildings that give us lots of information and sometimes, artistic vision. But I will ask the question, does the very existence of museums promote or maybe emphasize alterity? And I will also take a step back and talk about some past museological practices to connect it to the question, can others, ethnic, cultural, geographical others have museums? And then I will come back to our present time and I will try to conceptualize what museum translation entails now. And I will be discussing museums through the lens of being contact zones, being translation zones. And finally, I will connect everything, synthesize everything in translating otherness in space and time. And I will be calling it Museological Chronotope. And of course, this is all very much related to the notion of illusion. So how would a museum create fact out of fiction or fiction out of facts, and how we could see it as an illusion? So I will be trying to illustrating the illusionary nature of museums as well. So let's start. Again, I first of all want to, of course, connect museums, translation, and otherness. But then, since we're all semioticians here, then can maybe the concept of semiosphere give us answers? Well, luckily, yes. I'm sure you have all read this seminal essay by Lotman on the semiosphere. And in the very beginning of the essay, he makes this, he underlines this resemblance between museums and semiosphere. So to quote him, he says, imagine a room in a museum where exhibits from different eras are laid out in different windows with texts in known and unknown languages and instructions for deciphering them, together with explanatory text for the exhibitions created by guides who map the necessary routes and rules of behaviors for visitors. If we place into that room still more visitors with their own semiotic worlds, then we will begin to obtain something resembling a picture of semiosphere. So I think this is quite a solid start already to draw parallels between museums, translation, and otherness. But what do I really mean is that I'm sure I don't need to explain what semiosphere is, or I'm sure you know particularities of this concept, but to remind you, semiosphere has a bilingual border. And if we want new information, new text to be generated, then it has to basically pass through this filter. And this passing through is a translational process. So if we want to be able to see new text coming into semiosphere, it has to be translated by this border into the language of the interior, which is then the language of the semiosphere. And so if we imagine a non-text in the non or exosemiotic space, and if we are in the semiosphere, but that is invisible to us, we wouldn't be able to recognize it. Or the only way for us to recognize a non-text is by turning it into a text. And again, this is then creating new text, new information, new meaning, because it is translated or semioticized by this border. And then we can think of this border, this bilingual border that belongs both to the interior and the exterior, as a boundary that represents the border between the self and the other. So according to our dear professor Torop, this boundary not only enables the creation of identities, but also gives meaning to these identities, because it creates an opposition between the self and the other. Opposition, you can call it dialogue, you can call it tension, but it is created. Then basically what I'm trying to say here is that the understanding of self comes through the understanding of the other. It comes through being able to describe your own identity to yourself through the existence of the other. If you think about a situation in which it's only us that exists in the universe, well, in a case then we become the universe, it's impossible for us to recognize that we are ourselves. It's only through the recognition of something different than us, then only we can understand who we really are. So therefore, we could again quote Peter Torop once again, that the constructing the identity of the self is created through the identity of the other, and this separating, but at the same time creating boundary, creative boundary, is based on dialogue. Again, we can call it dialogue, we can call it opposition, we can call it tension, but if it's based on the dialogue between the self and other, then it's quite important already, because Lotman saw this as the elementary mechanism of translation. So I hope it is now becoming a little bit more clear why I think translation from the perspective of semiotics, and maybe not from the perspective of translation studies, because for translation studies, translation is built upon the understanding of language, whereas from the perspective of semioticians, translation could start even by recognizing the other. But this is also, I guess, quite similar to Lacan's mirror stage, but in a more abstract theoretical way. And how to connect it to museums. Well, if we accept that translation and the understanding of the other and the self are very closely tied to each other, then we can also observe it in museums. Now, Kate Storch in 2007 made an extremely important distinction that everyone who deals with museum translation knows today, which is the distinction between translation in museums and museums as translation. So translation in museums is basically what you would immediately think of when I say translation, right? Transfer from language A to language B in different forms. Then translation in museums would entail catering to visitors that have different linguocultural backgrounds and related expectations. And we could see it in the forms of intra or interlingually translated brochures. We can see it on labels, group texts, introductory texts, but also in audio guides, subtitles. And nowadays, some museums have apps. We could see it on museum apps. Actually, I haven't written here, but the topic of accessibility would also be falling under this category. So this is micro level concerns. When we switch to the other side, seeing museums as translation, then that entails macro level concerns, and it concentrates on constructing cultural representations through museum exhibitions. Or some museums don't have separate exhibitions, but it's just one museum, then that also counts. And then we could see it in the form of collecting materials, selecting the theme or the content, basically deciding what gets to be represented in which ways. In the sense, from my perspective, seeing museums as translation already starts outside of the museum. Imagine a scenario where a museum wants to create an exhibition and they talk to ethnographers, art historians, and they collect data for the museum. And then the curator and the curator's team select what would fit better to their vision and so on and so forth. So even this practice before being materialized as an exhibition in the museum falls under the category of museums as translation. And now this could also include organizing intertextuality of the exhibition or spatial arrangements through use of architecture in museums, so on and so forth. And I'm telling you this because if we can talk about the distinction between translation in museums and museums as translation, then we could also apply all of these things to otherness as well, because as we have seen from the previous slides, from my framework, actually, again, translation and otherness are pretty much connected. So this is what I will try to do. I will try to see otherness from different angles and not just from one angle. But maybe we can also talk a little bit about the history of museums as well, because nowadays we have the expectation that museums have to bring us knowledge, objective knowledge, precisely. We go to museums to learn something, and most of the time when we see something in a museum, we take it as a fact, and we most of the time forget the agency of the museum, agency of the institutions that could be related to the museum. We forget the agency of curators, architects, translators, and so on and so forth. And this is, believe it or not, quite a novel construct, starting from mid-19th century. But before that, museums did not have to, quote unquote, teach anything. Museums did not have to be didactic spaces, and it was the norm for centuries. Therefore, I find it important that we also quickly discuss the history of museums. So etymologically, actually, museum comes from the term museon, and it describes sites that are devoted to the muses. And since it could be any site, well, then a museum did not have to be a building. It could have been a garden, a temple, a festival, or even a book. Well, a scroll, let's say, but it could have been a book as well. So the understanding of museums was quite broad, just like my understanding of what translation is. And we see first museological practices in ancient Rome, because they had quite an inventory of sculptures or sometimes maybe columns that they brought from Greece. And they were interested in displaying that publicly, or sometimes also privately, but mostly publicly on their streets, or maybe sometimes in state buildings, sometimes in temples, in shrines. So even though we would not necessarily recognize this as a museological practice today, because we're so used to seeing contemporary museums, this is accepted as, like in museum studies, this is accepted as one of the first museological practices one could trace. And then we come across churches as museum galleries. So there is this shift from sacred space to museum gallery, mostly in medieval times. So the churches and their altars could in a way be considered as early forms of museums, because let's think about the functions of museums. Museums collect, museums preserve, museums display. All of these things could also be found in churches. But maybe instead of calling it an artwork, they call it a relic or a sacred artifact, and so on and so forth. And the resemblances do not stop there. So we don't have to go back in medieval times to see it. This is a photo that I took quite recently in Antwerp, Belgium, in the main cathedral. And here you can see a section of the cathedral, and people are looking at the artwork, people are looking at the beauty of the architecture. In the back, actually, there was also a little text that was explaining certain things, but unfortunately, I couldn't capture it, so I have to take my word for it. And you can even see a glass cabinet in which something is displayed. And you can imagine how it is similar to museums, and you even see people just admiring it. So they were not praying, they were just looking at the artwork there. And sometimes we see churches and cathedrals being used as exhibition halls as well, which was also the case in this one. I couldn't capture everything in one shot, but there was also something that was going on. So we see that sort of a shift. And then we have a transitional period with the Renaissance. One of the first things that pushed people to deal with museological practices was the rediscovery of Aristotle and his collection or categorizational methods. But what were these methods used for? They were used for categorizing and collecting exotic items coming from the New World. That was one of the milestones of museological practices. Well, this wasn't done publicly. This was usually done by important, rich, probably aristocratic people. And in a way, there was a source of prestige if you could obtain such items. And imagine if you have 10 items, you can put them in a small box or chest, but what happens if you have thousands of those? Then in a way you want to categorize them, and this is a museological practice already. And then there is a studio law of the Medici family in Florence. They had such a large collection that they had to create a studio space to display those, not necessarily to the public, but maybe to their family friends, to people that were also as powerful and important as they were. And then towards the Enlightenment, we see cabinets of curiosity. And you can see an example here below. Those would have small drawers, and the collector, which is also the owner, a keyword here, the owner would decide which drawer has which sort of artifacts and so on and so forth. And again, this was not something that you would find in a middle-class person's home, but this was a rich people practice, like a hobby. But towards the 19th century, especially mid-19th century, we finally see public and institutionalized museums with the intention to actually teach people something. So after so many centuries of collecting and displaying and representing and ownership, possession, in the 19th century, museums have become didactic spaces. And in the 20th century, this understanding has developed, museums become inclusive, educational grounds where cultural transfer, research, and social encounters can be conducted, or at least on paper it is. But why did I tell you about this? Well, I'm trying to come to the conclusion that, first of all, museums have the possibility to possess, present or represent, and interpret others' material culture. Their attitudes and conduct will always raise important questions on ownership and authority. So think about all of the practices I have listed to you. All of these happened in the Western world, first of all. And secondly, all of these collecting and presenting, representing, exhibiting practices are tied to power relationships. They were not all the time visionaries who were extremely interested in the artistic value of what they were collecting. The main idea was to possess as much as you could so that you can show how important you are, how intellectual you are, how much power you have. So then a museum represents not only this profound knowledge and inquisitiveness of the owner, the collectors towards the universe, because in a way, when you have a collection, you have a fragment of the universe within your hands, which is an immense power when you think about it. But on top of that, it means having the power and wealth enough to do it. Because being able to display an object implies being in a power relation with that object. And unfortunately, in this relation, the owner has a winning hand. An owner, in this sense, does not only mean the creator. We see that none of these things collected from different parts of the world came with their creators. And unfortunately, they were not consulted either. Of course, partly this happens because back then people did not know much about ethnography or cared about it. But also, again, the idea behind doing this was not purely artistic or didactic. It was completely political, ideological, or however you want to name it. So if you hold an object, if you own the object, and if you decide to present it or maybe hide it, because this is also a choice, then you decide what gets to be displayed and how it gets to be displayed, and this creates lots of possibilities of meaning generation, and that's why it can become quite dangerous. And connected to the issue of Western Eastern conflict, first of all, let me tell you that I deal with imagology. I know that there is no such fixed thing as Western. What is East, what is West, North, South, Center, Periphery. Those fluctuate depending on your position taking. But what I'm trying to explain here is that all of these practices, which can be based on stealing, looting, appropriating, come from the Western world, and it is, as you can understand, highly connected to colonial practices. So if the museum is a Western construct, can Easterners have museums? Since I'm originally Turkish, I thought bringing something that I know well would make sense here. So there are lots of missionaries or ambassadors or visitors that have been in the Ottoman Empire, and they wrote certain letters, some wrote books about it, and let's see what Western Europeans thought about Eastern practices. So according to Jacques Gassot, who lived in the 17th century, Turks do not value ancient monuments at all. and they are shameless because they take stones of ancient ruins and use those to construct their own palaces. And if they find ancient coins, they don't value the coins, and they just melt it and turn it into pots and pans, because for them those are some worthless coins of infidels and idolaters. Even in this excerpt, you can see the dynamic between the self and other. If you position yourself on the side of Jacques Gassot, then the other is the Turks, who do not value something intrinsically because sorry, how to formulate that? According to his perspective, the other would be the Turks, and they do not value those coins or those blocks because they don't have the understanding or the mentality that just because something is old, it has to be intrinsically important. And then we go to 18th century, there's Giambattista Casti. So he also thinks that people don't even repair old monuments or like ancient temples, ancient cities. And for him, it's a pity because those are the shadow that represents an amazing era in European history. But he thinks that those things are going to be ruined because Turks don't take care of these sites or I don't know, sculptures, monuments, etc. So once again, you can see that the dynamic between the self and other already, but maybe from the Turkish people's perspective in the 18th century, they don't feel obliged to value those things, and it's all about what your culture deems valuable or not. But does this mean that Easterners, or at least in my example, Turkish people, didn't they have any museological practice at all? Of course they did. One example would be the holy relics of Islam that were associated with Prophet Muhammad. And we can see that before 18th and 17th century, we can see two sultans actually bringing them and preserving them, displaying them in a room that was completely dedicated to those relics. And in that palace, actually, the relics were protected by servants every night. And even during some days, the room of that palace would be open to public so that everyone could see. Now, that is a museological practice from a different perspective. But then, basically what I'm trying to say here is that if you think about having museological practices in your culture, probably no matter where you go, which time period you look at, you will find something. But when I claim that the museum that we know today is a Western construct, then yes, it is because Western museums started with the idea of displaying the object of the others. Whereas the other museological practices would, in other parts of the world, would mostly entail preserving something that belongs to the self. And in the specific case, for instance, the self would be the Islamic self, and so on and so forth. So again, anyone can have museological practices, anyone can have museums, but the museum that we know is a Western product which has its roots in unfortunately quite terrible colonial practices. But if we stop with the history and think about now, how can we conceptualize museum translation and then, of course, connect it to the question of self and other? Well, museums now are multimodal and multi-semiotic places, and they serve as spaces where meaning making is constructed through contact. Then we can try to conceptualize museum translation through two approaches. One would be the understanding of contact zone, and the other one would be translation zone. If we quickly have to define what a contact zone is, it's a space characterized by colonial interactions. According to Marie-Louise Prat, who came up with this term, she suggests that this spatial and temporal relationships between different groups of people who encounter one another at frontiers are marked by cultural and social tensions, conflicts, and imbalances of power. Well, she actually had in mind not museums, but literal locations, for instance, political borders, refugee camps, war zones, and places of that sort. But you can already see, I hope, some keywords: spatial temporal relationships, encounter, tension, so on and so forth. But how can we connect it to the museums? Well, Pratt continues that museums are social spaces where disparate cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in highly asymmetrical relations of domination and subordination, like colonialism, slavery, or their aftermaths as they are lived out across the globe today. Well, when we think about it, museums are spaces in which all of these things happen, not only in the past, but also now. Then museums can be regarded, if you see museums as contact zones, museums can be regarded as spaces of encounter, negotiation, transfer, and learning, where objects, ideas, knowledge, customs, values, and emotions are collected, presented, and sometimes exchanged. So we talk about encounter, interaction, negotiation in museums. But when I say contact zone, what sort of contact are we really talking about? Because you might have lots of different contacts in museums. You can think of many examples, but I will highlight three main ones that would work quite well in the museum space. First, the type of contact could be source cultures contacting each other in the exhibition space. For instance, think of an ethnographic museum and there's a collection, there's an exhibition about, let's say, Central Asia. Then all of the people of Central Asia, in a way, maybe metonymically, come together in the exhibition space because their artifacts, their culture, their way of looking at the world is represented in the exhibition. So source cultures can have a quite silent exchange, silent contact with each other. Then, of course, there is the obvious contact between the exhibition and the visitors. The represented cultures establish contact with the audience through the museum's mediation. And then we could also think about the contact of visitors. It could be a deliberate contact, or maybe it's an unconscious contact, but there are lots of studies that show that even acknowledging others in the museum space and how you acknowledge them could change the meaning you make out of an exhibition. There are not only architects that deal with it, but also people from museum studies and translation studies. So it's already known fact nowadays. And the sort of contact could vary depending on the social cultural backgrounds, daily mood, the layout of the exhibition halls, the spacing between displays, the availability of multiple paths for visitors to choose from, etc., etc. So these could be the main contacts we could see if we want to accept museums as contact zones with the other. But then what about translation zones? Well, according to Sherry Simon, translation is logically one of the major activities in the contact zone. And if you think about some of the past definitions I brought regarding translation and otherness in the first slides, I think it fits quite well with Sherry Simon's understanding. So the translation zone, in the sense, defines the epistemological interstice of politics, poetics, logic, cybernetics, linguistics, semiotics, media, and environment. Its locomotion characterizes both psychic transference and the technology of information transfer. Then, museums as translation zones can encompass both verbal and non-verbal translations of cultures within the museum setting. So those could be two ways of conceptualizing museum translation. But what about illusions? Because in my title, I promised talking about illusions. Now we talk about translation in relation to the other, the clash between the self and other, meanings being generated, the powerful position, the upper hand museums and curators have when it comes to representing others, then how can we also not say that whatever you see in the museum is an illusionary construct? Because it just represents a fragment of the universe, of reality, but completely mediated by someone and their team, yeah, by the curator and the curatorial team. And most of the times, the curator is not just an individual, they are connected to the museum. Most museums are connected to the state, or maybe universities, or maybe some other higher institutions. Certain states can have quite ideological approaches to what gets to be displayed how. So when we think of all of these things, the illusionary nature of the museum already emerges, even though I will also talk about this a bit later. But here I would like to show you a video from Museum aan de Stroom in Antwerp, in Belgium. And what I'm going to show you is a cluster in an exhibition hall. And you will see that it's a round cluster. So in museum studies, there are two ways of exhibiting. One of them is called L. L means horizontal display techniques, and T means vertical display techniques. So we see T type of exhibits. Everything is under a glass barrier, and let's just show you. The entrance is through there, and except for the entrance and the bars here, when you enter through this cluster, the entrance, in a really large exhibition hall, your whole contact with the outside world is cut. I don't know how they manage it, but you also don't get to hear anything within the exhibition hall. And let me reiterate that the exhibition hall is quite vast, and then there is this cluster, and the exhibition is actually about celebrations. So this museum has this exhibition that is demonstrating how different cultures, different religions have various celebrations and why certain things are celebrated. And this was a cluster for Congo. I'm sure you know the bloody, terrible relationship between Belgium and Congo coming from the past. So Congo should be a really sensitive topic for Belgium if they're interested in not just being politically correct, but if they're interested in being human, they should be careful about how they represent a country like Congo. And you might think that, okay, what's wrong? Everything looks clean, well done. Well, the first problem was that there were texts, group texts, but when you take a closer look, which is impossible for me to show you one by one, it would take hours, but take my word for it, the information given did not coincide with the artifacts in the cluster. First of all, that was a huge problem. And secondly, there were certain things that only had a label but no explanation. Now, it will make more sense if I compare it with some other parts of the exhibition hall. So this is another corner from the exhibition hall, and you can see that the design is now switched to L, and L the horizontal display actually promotes, according to museum studies, promotes more interaction and engagement with the visitors, and visitors feel more connected to what is displayed. And not only some other parts of this exhibition get bigger introductory texts, because Congo cluster, which was the only cluster that I found quite weird anyways, it did not have an introductory text like the other one. It only had group texts, meaning smaller texts, less informative. But for other stuff, they had a quite big displays of showing lots of different objects, and the information was quite clear and explicit, and they even consulted the people who did certain celebrations. So each screen that you see on the side of the street is connected to these headphones, and if you want to learn more about what is being shown, you can just listen to it in 4 languages, and the people are given voice. So the users, creators of these objects, and the people who actually celebrate those events are telling you directly. Whereas if we go back to the cluster, for instance, there is a video of...
The video has no title.
Sorry. Yeah, so the video has no title. There is only a small label, and the label does not tell you where these people are from. Okay, we say Congo, but Congo is a huge country. Where in Congo? What ethnic group or what cultural group is it? Is it a religious celebration? Are they even celebrating? What are these people doing? Are they dancing? So there's this quite distancing between you and what is being displayed in the Congo cluster. And unfortunately, you feel othered. You feel being excluded from what's going on, and it's impossible for you to make a connection. And according to International Council of Museums, ICOM, their 2022 definition of what a museum is definitely involves inclusion. But not only the Congolese are not included, you as a visitor are not included either. And this is not just a coincidence. This is a pattern that I have seen time and time again in this museum, that I'm confident enough to show this to you. But this is just a small example of how translation can become a dangerous tool in the hands of the people who have prejudices, biases, maybe certain ideology that might be harmful to the unity and integrity of humanity, and so on and so forth. So here what happens is that if you can select, represent, speak, and exhibit on behalf of the other without consulting the other, then unfortunately we have absence of voice, and there is a huge power asymmetry. So here I will share 2 quotes with you, one from Levin and Karp, and the other one from Dominguez. You'll see that they're quite outdated, one from 1991, another will be from 86, but they're quite relevant, which is quite sad to me. But basically they say that decisions about how cultures are presented reflect deeper judgments about what a nation is or ought to be, as well as how citizens should relate to one another. Sometimes it is easier to understand the political and social implications of such decisions when one looks at the museums of other cultures. And here, Dominguez formulates that museums as translations can be read as referential indices of the self. Their concrete objects come from other societies, but everything about the collection itself, the way objects were collected, why they were collected, and how and why they get displayed, points to us. So what we see in that cluster actually does not necessarily point to the Congolese, but it points to, well, the curator, or whoever told the curator to create such an exhibition. And maybe since it's a state museum, it connected to Flanders and the Flemish identity, and so forth. So it goes a long way. But then let's think, for a second. Are museums those terrible monsters that deliberately translate things in a terrible fashion? And is it full of bad people? No, of course, that's not what I'm suggesting. That's why, to take a fresher breath, I suggest let's zoom out a little bit and talk more about how museums translate anything at all, actually, without coming to the practical sense. So I suggest that museums translate space and time. And let me elaborate if my slides move. Yeah. So basically what I say is that museums model the world, museums model the universe. Every museum does it. And this modeling is based on the vision of the museum, the artistic, sociological, political perspective of the museum. Of course, there's also the financial part, because without financial resources, it's not quite possible to have a good exhibition. So there are lots of factors that are involved in the process, but in the end, every museum is presenting its own modeling of the world. And this modeling process involves representing a specific portion of the universe through an exhibition. So in a way, you can think about any museum. Also, I don't know, geological museums, natural history museums, doesn't always have to be related to culture and ethnography, but think about any museum, any exhibition, and try to tell me if it's not, in a way, modeling, translating, summarizing a portion of the world, a portion of the universe. It does. And this I recognize as translation. So in that sense, both space and time are fundamental components of museums, and therefore also of museum translation. When I say space, I don't mean outer space. I mean like topos. Therefore, I call this combination as the museological chronotope. So the experience of the museum becomes this museological chronotope, where the intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships is materialized, and where space becomes charged and responsive to movements of time, plot, and history. Of course, if you read Bakhtin, you will see that he didn't necessarily mean museums when he was talking about chronotope. But if we apply it to the museums, we can see lots of interesting parallels. That's why I decided to call this museological chronotope. So what I'm basically saying is that during this modeling process, space and time is somehow translated into the exhibition. But there is also another aspect, a more practical aspect of space and time being translated, which is maybe falling under the category of translation in museums, as I have illustrated in the very beginning of my talk. So this could entail the selection, recontextualization, and display of chosen collection within the constraint of space, because the museum building has a boundary, or if you're talking about a virtual museum, which I see popping up here and there, or like 3D tours, they also have a capacity, they also have their limits. So either physical or virtual boundary, but there is a spatial boundary when you think about it. And then, of course, time is also involved, because every museum has to consider the duration of the museum visits and the attention span of the visitors and similar factors. So on a more practical aspect, we could still see time and space being involved in the museum. But now our interest is more focused on the others, authority. So I was reading quite an interesting article by Patou-Mathis, and he's an archaeologist. He used the terms l'autre dans l'espace and l'autre dans le temps. And he was using these terms to indicate how prehistory museums translate the term he actually used, which is interesting for me to see from an archaeologist's perspective. But he was talking about how museums translate the image of prehistoric humans in the museums. And he came up with this term set, and I quite liked it and wanted to use it myself. So in the translation, embedded in the translational layers in the museum, we can see others in space and others in time. And to me, this is quite a novel way of seeing things, because usually when you deal with museum translation or any of these topics, you can see some other perspectives, such as the distinction between verbal translation and non-verbal translation in the museum, or the side of the curator versus the side of the visitor, or maybe exhibition and the online presence of the museum, or the clash between data collection and how to present or represent that collection, etc. But seeing it through the perspective of time and space can, I believe, bring a more holistic approach, because it's combinatorial. And I'll give you some examples. For instance, this was a picture I've taken from Mardin Museum in Turkey. And here we can see, for instance, the translation of the others in space. Turkey has minoritized groups, so we can see how they are represented, hence translated in the museum. These are Syriac, Yazidi, and according to what they call Muslim women together. And there was a whole exhibition about the minoritized groups in Turkey in that museum. So they are contemporaries of Turkish people. They live at the same time, but they're from different locations coming together in the museum. Or another example could be translating others in time. So this was in the National Museum of Finland, and here they see some interesting stones, and they're not quite sure if they were made by their ancestors or not. But the discourse is based on the fact that people who lived, let's say, 10,000 years ago were also Finns, and they might have made these little hand axes or hand axe looking stones. So then this would be translating the others in time, because the museum included the identity of these prehistoric humans in the within the boundaries of the self. So the only distinction was time between them. But in most cases, it's combinatorial. In the museums, we see both of them together. This is, for instance, this was illustrated by Jannica Andersen and Maria Kristina Lotman in 2018. They looked at the Tartu, University of Tartu Art Museum, which I'm sure most of us have seen if you're from Tartu. So in this museum, there are no originals, but they're copies of ancient art. And according to the framework of Andersen and Lotman, this was for them intra-semiotic translation in the museum, and they propose an interesting not taxonomy, but typology of intrasemiotic translation in the museum, depending on what sort of changes were made to the copies according to different time periods. But then you see not only the translation of the others in time, because it's ancient art, but also others in space, because they do not belong to the Estonian self. So in most museums, that would be a combinatorial case, which gives us the basics of the museological chronotope. Sorry, I can't see my slides. Okay, it's fixed. Yeah, so we're talking about creating a museological chronotope, but what I say is that it also promotes cultural translation and identity building. So what we could say is that the representation of others in time or in space make museums spaces of cultural translation specifically. So starting from that, we can say that museum translation is one form of cultural translation, since museums translate cultures through the selection and combination of objects. Texts here neither means verbal texts, and other representational apparatus in the exhibitionary space. Then we could also suggest that museums function as a frontier, a zone for intercultural understanding, which is quite on par with what I said earlier about museums as contact zones and translation zones. But, well, yeah, museums, when functioning as a frontier, a zone, where learning is created, new identities are forged, new connections are made between disparate groups and their own histories. In that sense, translating, if you try to connect it to translating the self and the others in the museum, then the making of national identities in the museum becomes prominent, as museums possess the authoritative agency to determine which identities to represent and which identities to suppress in silence. So basically, keyword here should be the authoritative agency of museums, because again, this is where the illusion that we have in our minds comes from. When we enter the museum building, we expect pure knowledge. We just absorb it as if it's unchangeable truth, but it is not, as we have, for instance, seen from the Congo cluster. But then, fact or fiction, what do we see in museums? Can we see facts in museums? Is it all fictional in a way? Well, this is the museum who decides as an agent in this process, and it's the authoritative museum. So Tony Bennett suggests that exhibitionary forms in museums can function as translations of knowledge power relations. Yes, Tyler says it's time to wrap up. I am almost done, basically. Just maybe 5 minutes, okay? So through the decisions of curators, whose choices may not always be justified, exhibitions not only implicitly and perhaps inadvertently represent the perspective of ethnic majorities in museums, but also can reframe and reposition the identities and voices of minoritized groups. When we think about the museum, it is a physically organized space made up of a series of syncretic manifestations that reflect the values and culture of a society, which presents itself as a space that emulates knowledge. And to me, the irony in the switch between fact and fiction is that it is connected to the de facto expectation that museums always provide didactic and objective information, but then again, museums just create illusions through either turning facts into fiction or having facts and trying to sell them as facts. So there's the question of obtaining objective and unfiltered facts about art, history, nature, science, anticipating being surrounded by a neutral and unbiased representation of the universe. It's not possible. But this is all based on the authoritative image museums have built until the present day that we have a hard time questioning that, unfortunately. I'll give you a quick example of how we can create certain illusions or creating fictions or facts. So let's say that we see this and we see the accompanying text here as its label. Think about what sort of meanings you would get from that. But how about you decide to label it like this? The difference does not necessarily come from the fact that second label is longer, but it creates more connection between the visitor and the artifact, because from, let's say, the European perspective, this object may not indicate anything, but once you have this sort of an information, you might connect to it a little bit more. But how about this? Again, the difference does not necessarily come from the fact that it's longer or gives more information, but it comes from the fact that it's connecting. So it's trying to explain, this sort of a label is trying to actually explain you what it is. And not only it does that, it involves you in the dialogue as the visitor, because at the end it asks, can you think of a similar practice in your culture? So this is an inclusive way of creating a museum label, for instance, whereas the first one looks like it's just giving unbiased neutral knowledge, but it's actually not doing that. It just creates distance between the source culture and you as a target culture. My last example is going to be a museum where the curator is very well aware of the fact that museums can be purely fictional, and he plays with the illusionary nature of museums. So I wanted to include this because I demonstrated lots of heavy examples, or at least they are heavy to me, so I assume they were heavy for you, in the sense that it promotes colonial mindset still in 2024. But this is a fun example. This is the Museum of Innocence in Istanbul, Turkey. It is a physical museum. You can go there, you can touch, the walls. It exists in the physical sense, but it's a purely fictional museum. It is based on a novel that Orhan Pamuk, who is also the creator, wrote. And Pamuk insists that it's one of the characters that created this museum, and he collected everything. And of course, this character has never lived, but he insists on interviews. He insists on some books, not literary works, but just some other informational books that he wrote about the museum. He insists that this person called Kemal was the curator. And for instance, in the museum, you can visit Kemal's room, and you would expect factual knowledge, objective knowledge, neutral knowledge in the museum. So if you see a text, you should take it as the truth. But he plays with your senses and insists that Kemal Basmacı, this character, who for him is not a character, it's a person, lived in this room and passed away in this room. Or there are quotes by Kemal as the curator. And there also, it's not just about Kemal, the curator, but there are some other characters. And for instance, Pamuk, from the mediative power of using this character as the fictional creator, he tells the stories of some other characters. He insists that, for example, this dress was worn by another character, and on the side you can even see her identity card, or there is a wall, a giant wall that is made out of 4,000 plus cigarette butts that he claims was smoked by this lady, and so on and so forth. So it's also possible to see some museums that make fun of this situation, even though it's quite rare. But I just wanted to show you that does not always have to be a heavy case. So in conclusion, if we take a critical viewpoint that considers issues such as voice, representation, cultural translation, prejudices, biases, and colonialism, then museums, translation, and otherness can be seen as closely related concepts. The connection between translation and museums is not exclusive to translation proper, meaning the transfer from language A to language B, as even the very existence of museums can be regarded as translations. And given that museums, in the way that we know them, as we know them currently, are the result of colonial practices involving, unfortunately, looting and appropriation, it's impossible to discuss museums without the role of the other. And while the definition of the self and other may vary based on our position takings, because they're dynamic notions, the interaction between these two is constant. No matter which position you take, no matter how you think the boundaries are made out of, there's always this tension, this dialogue, and it's constant. And it gives rise both to translation, but also to culture. And lastly, given the authoritative control over the selection, elimination, presentation, and representation, museums possess the ability to transform factual information into fictional narratives, and vice versa. Then, within the museum space, everything we come across is an illusion, is a construct. And this is not only because curators have the power to select what is displayed through which ways, but also because exhibitions are models of space and time coming together. And as a result, they can only depict reality through the fragments of illusions within the museological chronotope. And that's basically all from me. Thanks a lot for listening. I will stop sharing my screen and maybe we will have some questions.
All right then.